Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and here we have a copy of Ironsight's 2 Psychos. And this is a real treat for me because this is the first time I'm going to be looking at a sequel to a project I have already backed. And of course I did a review of the original Ironsights quite some time ago, and I was really excited to see that Ironsights 2 was coming because I am really a big fan of that book and this one. And let's just dive into it. Let's have a look and see if your boy Zach did better with this outing than he did in the original. And spoiler alert, he did. This book is interesting for a couple of reasons on the form factor front. The first being that there was a different printer used for this one, as I understand it. And the difference in the form factor does really show through. The cover has a very different feel to it. It's not as slick or as smooth. It doesn't feel any less sturdy, but I don't know, there's something different about it. If I knew more about the paper stock they used for things like this, maybe I could explain it better, but I don't. All I can really tell you is that it doesn't feel quite as smooth or as slick as that cover, and I mean that's not necessarily bad, but the difference in consistency is very noticeable to me. The second thing to talk about is the interior, and I'm not going to talk about this as a art issue. I'm going to talk about it as a form factor issue because we know that the printer that Zach used for this had some kind of issue with the Zipatone that Canalis used to do his shading work on, and so he had to come back and take out the Zipatones and put in some kind of grayscaling. And some of it is, I don't, it's rough working in a new medium. I don't know how easy it was to take the Zipatone out and how easy it was to replace it with this grayscale flatting that you see here, but some of it just looks ugly. And this panel right here, I don't know if you can see that on the camera or not, but you can really tell that this was just photoshopped on, and it looks like some of it was erased, and I don't know why it was done this way or why it looks this way, but there are definitely pages where it's very noticeable that Ibai was working in a medium he's not familiar with, and also that he was rushed. This was kind of a rush job because they were not expecting to have to do this. They were expecting to be able to print with Zipatone. The other thing is, I don't know if it's an effect of the line art or what, but it was intended to be done with Zipatone, not with this grayscaling. And a lot of the pages look kind of muddy as a result of that. And I mean, it's certainly not a deal breaker, but it does make the book look worse. And again, I don't consider it an art issue because we're really not looking at the intended product anymore. We are looking at a quick fix that was done in the middle of the production process with very little warning. It does impact the quality, but I consider this a failing of the form factor or a result of the decision to switch printers, and not so much a failure of Ibai Canalis as an artist, because it's really not. He was, there was a last minute change and he was rushed. It is, however, kind of a mark against the book because some pages it looks fine, some pages it just looks ugly. And hopefully, working with this illustration style from the ground up for next time, assuming there is going to be an Ironsights 3, it's well set up for one. Hopefully it will look better than it does in this book. So let's talk about Ibai Canalis now, because he has grown immensely as an artist. Ibai continues to be very good at drawing faces. That was probably my favorite part of his art style in the first book. You can see right here, Ramadi has this really great craggy face. His buddy here, I don't remember his name, but he has, a very expressive face. All of Ibai's faces are highly expressive, and sometimes they kind of verge into cartoonish, like again on this page. Here at the bottom, you see Ramadi with his eyes bugging out. But all things considered, I continue to like his face work. He's gotten a lot better at drawing figures and posing them, and he wasn't exactly bad at that previously, but he has improved quite a bit in this book. His action scenes are a lot more kinetic, and all in all, just vast improvements across the board. If the original Iron Sights was, call it a 6 or a 7, then Ibai has definitely moved his way up to an 8, maybe an 8.5. And, you know, that's pretty good progress. And hopefully we will continue to see Ibai working on Iron Sights books and continuing to improve, because, I mean, the man deserves continued opportunities. I know there are a lot of people who don't like Ibai's style. They think it's a little rough, or they think it's too cartoony because of the expressions and the variety of his faces. Personally, I think it's appropriate for this kind of really gritty, crime-driven kind of story. If I had like one gripe that I would consider to be actually the fault of Ibai's art rather than the rapid change in his flatting style or removing the zipatones, whatever you want to call that, I would say, well, actually, I have two real issues. The first is I feel many of his panel layouts could be a little more dynamic, and you know, we have a lot of straight edge panels, very few angled panels or characters breaking out of panels, stuff like that. Now, maybe that's appropriate given the kind of story. This is a really realistic, gritty crime story. Again, I do prefer more dynamic art with wilder panels and composition, and maybe that wouldn't really fit with what's trying to happen here. I haven't seen Ibai ever use those, but I've only read these two books with his art, so he could be more experimental in some other stories where it would be more appropriate. I would like to see it. In general, I like to see those kind of layouts. Not on every page, you know, but on occasion. And I can't recall any instance where I've seen Ibai do something like that. And the other is, well, Ibai is very good at representing the male figure. His female figures sometimes look a little bit off. I don't know if it's proportions or the way he poses them, but it's something that could use some work. And I understand that it can be difficult to make really appealing, getting a really appealing female figure down on the page. I have struggled with that myself, but he's improving in a lot of other areas, and that's an area that could use improvement as well. So there you go. And finally, let's talk about the story. Now, this story is, it does not have a lot of the problems that the previous Iron Sights had. Like one of my biggest problems with Iron Sights is there was a moment in there where Ramadi, his sister, was a potential, something that could potentially be held over his head by the people he was fighting, so he just sent her out of town. I didn't like that because it felt like it lowered stakes at a time when they really needed to be raised. And the other thing was there was a mute character in that who just popped up out of nowhere in the second half of the book, and that really bothered me. This book has neither of those kind of narrative glitches to it. It is much smoother. Characters are introduced much earlier. Like here we have Harm, and this guy is a new character introduced in the middle of the story, and he is, I mean, really, this is very early in the story, and this is where he's technically introduced. But he's also a player in the main story. This is a flashback to Ramadi's time in, I think, Afghanistan. Don't quote me on that. Let's see. Do they say where this is? Oh, okay. This is the present day. I'm sorry. I thought he was introduced in the flashback. So I guess he is set up here in the modern day. So yeah, all of the characters that are going to be important, even if they don't have a big part part to play in the early part of the story are set up here. And so your boy Zach does a pretty good job of giving us an idea of who all our players are going to be, how they're related to each other, and all this kind of stuff. I really like the new character. Harm is fascinating as a character and as a plot piece. He has he's connected to Woods. He says that right there. So I'm not 100% sure what Woods was doing and how all that was supposed to shake out. We do know that Woods was supposed to meet back up with Harm after the big shootout in Iron Sights 1, which obviously he can't do now because he's dead. Spoilers for Iron Sights 1, by the way. But Harm was supposed to meet up with him, and I like that for a lot of reasons. Woods was my favorite character in the original Iron Sights, and Harm seems to have many of the same character traits that made Woods fun and interesting. He's a hard ass. He doesn't take crap from people, and he largely just goes balls to the wall until he gets through with whatever problem he's dealing with. Ramadi is here as well. He is, of course, the main character from the first book, and he is now tied up with this drug cartel that Esme is running, and he's kind of an enforcer / lieutenant, but he's got a weird mix of guilt and trauma and general decline in how well he's doing that has kind of lost him a lot of favor in the organization. He is just, he can't hack it, unfortunately. Finally, we have this Melchizedek guy, and he also seems to come up out of nowhere. We don't know why he is in Mexico. We don't know what he wants. All we really know is that his name, he calls himself Melchizedek. Don't know if that's his government name or not, but he believes he's the son of God, and he wants people to call him Mel. And he is definitely one of the two psychos mentioned in the title of this book. And long story short, there are some journalists who are trying to take down a cartel, and Esme's cartel draws the short end of the stick, and a bunch of stuff happens, and the cartel gets knocked over. And this book does a really great job of keeping the action building. There are fewer moments of downtime or odd moments of quirky investigation. They do happen, but they don't involve Ramadi or Harm or any of the central cast. We basically, as a B plot running along this, there are some G-men who are, I believe, start out stateside and work their way south, who are trying to figure out what happened to Woods and put together the pieces of his last operation, which you really don't get in this book, but that's fine because, again, it's a setup for book 3. So most of the story is about Harm, Ramadi, and Melchizedek on one side, Esme's cartel on the other side, and these journalists who are egging them on to destroying each other on a third side. And it's a pretty good villain brawl. There's no real good guys in here. They all blow the crap out of each other. Harm seems like a more upstanding guy than Ramadi was. He's still not a great person, but he is more of a lovable rogue, I think, than Ramadi is, and more of a lovable rogue, really, than Woods was. All in all, he's a lot of fun to read, and Melchizedek is, he's the quirky sidekick, for better and for worse. Sometimes he just says stuff, and I'm like, why is he saying this stuff? And other times he is actually, you can kind of make sense of what he's doing. And, I like the characters, and I like the plot. There's a big twist in here, which I will spoil in a little bit, but I'm not going to spoil right now. On the whole, the plot holds together really well, whereas the original Iron Sights just held together kind of good. And so it's good to see that improvement. This isn't very deep. It isn't very complex. It's just a fun shoot-'em-up action story. And if that's what you're looking for, this will deliver. I should also note that I complained in the first book that sometimes Zach's jokes just felt like stories from real life that he had kind of taken out and rejiggered and put back into this story. And every author has a desire to do that, and I said I didn't care for it, and I hoped it worked his way out of his writing. And lo and behold, as of this book, it has. I didn't see anything like that in here. It's possible there is something like that in here, and Zach just did a better job of integrating it. But by and large, that foible of his writing seems to have either been overcome through technical skill or been cut, and I appreciate seeing that. So all in all, great improvement on Zach as a writer. Now, my final recommendation is you should probably buy this book if you like these kinds of villain brawl or outlaw, outlaw versus outlaw kind of books, and or if you just like, gunplay action type stories, you're going to enjoy this. So that's the recommendation. Now let's talk about the spoiler, because Zach does something here that I really like, and it is a spoiler. So if you don't want to hear that spoiler, I've said spoiler like 5 times in the last 30 seconds, so hopefully you've noped out by this point. So Ramadi dies in this book, and it's not like a big dramatic moment. It doesn't get a huge amount of setup. Ramadi just dies kind of quickly and mercilessly in the middle of this book. And with that, Harm is pretty much set up to be the protagonist of the second half of the book and presumably book 3, assuming book 3 continues down this line. And that's a pretty bold choice. Ramadi was not the coolest protagonist, but he was the protagonist we came into this book with, kind of the guy we expected to go with. He's a different person, as I said before, than he was in the first book, and I kind of set him up pretty clearly to be removed. He had a lot of issues that would need to be worked out before he could be a really good, strong central character, and it would have been interesting to see him try and work them out, but that would have drastically changed the kind of story, and Iron Sights is not trying to be the story of a guy with guilt and panic issues overcoming them. Iron Sights is an adrenaline-fueled romp, so I think removing Ramadi as the protagonist and replacing him with a more likable and more action hero-y kind of a character is a good choice going forward. It will keep the stories lighter, faster, and without the protagonist having to constantly grapple with a lot of the junk that Ramadi's carrying. I think the stories will overall be better. The other interesting thing is that Esme is the only member of the cartel to survive its overthrow, which sets her up to recur as a villain in part 3. And that's an interesting choice as well. It gives the franchise a central villain who we understand why she's not constantly cropping up in these stories. But she's building connections, she's growing more ruthless, and while her cartel has been wiped out, and she's the only one who escapes, I'm sure we will be seeing her again, positioning in a new organization and posing a new threat. So I hadn't expected, honestly, for there to be for the uniting thread in this franchise to be the villain. But assuming that Zach continues to go with that, she could evolve to be a really dangerous and compelling femme fatale for the series as it goes on. And I kind of like that. I look forward to seeing what happens with that character as well. So, hopefully you enjoyed that and got something useful out of it. If you did, there's a like button and subscribe button down below. You can use them as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.